For generations, power has been explained to us through familiar symbols. Crowns resting on heads, thrones carved from stone, armies marching beneath banners, castles rising over conquered ground. That is how medieval Europe is usually remembered. But one of the most decisive forces of the age wore no crown, commanded no capital, and swore loyalty to no single ruler. It had no standing army, no borders to defend, no divine mandate to justify its authority. And yet it bent prices, controlled access to markets, disciplined kings, and quietly determined which cities flourished and which slowly fell into decline. Its reach stretched across rivers and seas, from London's docks to Novgorod's markets, from the North Sea into the heart of the Baltic world. It did not expand by conquest, did not rule through law or bloodline. It operated through connection, through coordination, through trust. This was not an empire in the traditional sense. It was a network, an aligned community of merchants who understood something rulers were still struggling to grasp. If you control the flow of trade, you don't need to control the land beneath it. Power will find its way to you. This is a story about money without crowns, authority without armies, and influence without sovereignty. To understand how merchants came to rival kings in medieval Europe, you have to abandon the idea that authority was ever stable in the first place. The medieval world was not governed by neat borders or predictable institutions. It was a landscape defined by uncertainty. After the collapse of Roman administration, Northern Europe fractured into overlapping claims of power. Dukes, bishops, city councils, feudal lords, and monarchs all asserted authority, often over the same territory and rarely in agreement with one another. For ordinary people, this meant confusion. For merchants, it meant danger. Laws changed from one town to the next. Toll stations appeared without warning. Justice depended less on written codes and more on who controlled the road, the bridge, or the harbor. A trader could cross a river and suddenly find his contracts unenforceable, his cargo taxable, or his safety negotiable. Trade existed, but it existed inside a constant state of risk. The sea offered no refuge. The North Sea and the Baltic were crowded with pirates, privators, and opportunistic local rulers who treated merchant ships as mobile tax bases. Overland routes were no better. Caravans faced extortion, seizure, or outright violence. A single voyage could wipe out years of accumulated capital. And when losses occurred, there was rarely a higher authority capable or willing to intervene. Kings enjoyed the benefits of trade when it passed through their domains. They taxed it, regulated it, and claimed a share of its profits. But once goods left their borders, royal protection faded. Sovereignty stopped at the water's edge or the forest path. For merchants operating across regions, this created a brutal imbalance. They generated wealth for states that could not or would not guarantee their survival. Despite this, trade did not slow down. It expanded. Northern Europe possessed resources the rest of the continent needed desperately: timber for construction and shipbuilding, grain to feed growing urban populations, salt for preservation, fish fur, wool, and amber for regional and international markets. Demand continued to rise regardless of political instability. Cities grew, consumption increased. The economic incentive was too strong to ignore. What held trade back was not opportunity, but trust. Merchants were forced to deal with strangers across linguistic, legal, and cultural boundaries. Agreements depended on personal reputation rather than institutional enforcement. A broken deal could mean total loss. This environment, trust was not abstract, it was survival. Merchants faced a decision: continue operating alone, exposed to violence, theft, and arbitrary rule, or find a way to reduce risk collectively, not through ideology, not through revolution, but through coordination. The earliest steps were simple. Traders began traveling together. Ships sailed in convoys. Information was shared quietly: which ports were safe, which officials could be bribed, which routes were too dangerous to attempt. These arrangements were informal and temporary, but they worked. Losses declined, costs fell, profits stabilized. What merchants discovered was something rulers had not yet fully grasped. Protection did not always require force. Sometimes it required alignment. An alignment, once established, had a tendency to grow. As cooperation spread, It began to reshape the geography of trade itself. Certain cities became reliable, others did not. Merchants gravitated toward ports where agreements were respected. Disputes were resolved, and local authorities understood the value of predictable commerce. Over time, trade routes stopped reflecting pure geography and started reflecting trust. Cities like Lübeck and Hamburg emerged not because they were militarily dominant, but because they were strategically indispensable. Lübeck connected inland Europe to the Baltic. Hamburg linked river systems to the North Sea. These cities became nodes, places where goods, capital, and information converged. To bypass them was costly. To exclude them was nearly impossible. Importantly, no one planned this outcome. There was no founding document, no central authority, no declaration of intent. The network grew organically. Merchants adjusted their behavior because it made economic sense. Cities supported them because trade brought revenue. Over time, repeated cooperation hardened into expectation. Expectation evolved into rules, and rules created leverage. Something subtle changed as the network expanded. Trade stopped being just an exchange of goods and became a mechanism of enforcement. If a city mistreated merchants, trade slowed. If a ruler violated agreements, ships stopped arriving. Supplies tightened. Prices rose. The consequences were economic, not military, but they were immediate. This system did not rely on violence. It relied on exclusion. And in a world dependent on trade, exclusion was devastating. Cities learned quickly that access to merchant networks mattered more than formal allegiance. Kings controlled land, merchants controlled flow, and flow determined survival. As coordination deepened, merchants began standardizing how business was conducted. Contracts, weights, measures, and commercial customs became increasingly uniform across cities that shared no political unity. A deal made in one port could be understood and enforced in another. This alignment reduced friction in ways medieval governments could not replicate. The network also institutionalized its presence abroad. In major foreign cities, merchants established permanent trading enclaves, self-governing districts that operated under their own commercial rules. These enclaves stored goods, housed traders, resolved disputes internally, and negotiated as a group with local authorities. If a ruler wanted access to trade, negotiations were collective. That distinction mattered. Individual merchant could be pressured or ignored. Coordinated network controlling essential supply chains could not. Leverage shifted quietly, but decisively. When conflicts arose, responses were standardized. No appeals, no rhetoric. Trade stopped, ships rerouted, goods withheld. Economic pressure replaced diplomatic pleading. This was not war in the traditional sense, but it achieved similar results without bloodshed. Profit enforced discipline. Merchants who violated rules found themselves isolated. Cities that broke trust lost access. Compliance was not moral, it was rational. Participation continued, not because of loyalty, but because alternatives were worse. What emerged was a new form of power, one that did not depend on divine legitimacy, inherited titles, or territorial conquest. It depended on coordination, logistics, and mutual enforcement. The foundations of cartel behavior were already in place. Shared interests, shared rules, shared consequences, even if no one used that language yet. As the merchant network matured, rulers began to understand what had happened, often too late. Northern Europe had become dependent on trade flows merchants controlled. Grain shortages destabilized cities. Timber shortages stalled shipbuilding. Salt shortages disrupted food preservation. The network sat at the choke points of all three. Privileges were granted not out of generosity, but necessity. Exemptions, protections, and special rights followed. Sovereignty meant little when markets turned hostile. Rulers who pushed too hard discovered how fragile authority could be without access to commerce. This did not make the system popular. Local merchants resented exclusion. Cities left outside accused the network of monopolistic behavior. And they were not wrong. Prices were coordinated. Access was restricted. Supply was managed. By modern standards, it behaved like a cartel. The difference was simple. There was no regulatory authority capable of stopping it. The network's power was tested openly in the 14th century. When Danish kings threatened merchant interests in the Baltic, the response was not symbolic. Fleets were raised, ports were blockaded, treaties were negotiated directly. Outcome was not royal victory but concession. A coalition without a crown forced a monarch to renegotiate. And yet, despite this, the network never became a state. It had no capital, no permanent treasury, no centralized military command. Meetings were irregular. Participation was voluntary. Decisions were slow. On paper, it appeared fragile. In practice, it endured. Its strength came from alignment. Protect the system, and the system protects you. That principle outlasted dynasties. Borders shifted. Rulers fell. The network adapted. Trade routes moved. Hubs changed. Shocks were absorbed. It behaved less like a government and more like a market organism, responsive, pragmatic, and focused on survival. But adaptability had limits. Over time, rules hardened, innovation slowed, new competitors emerged. Atlantic trade expanded. States centralized authority, built navies, enforced law, and issued credit at scales merchants could no longer outmaneuver indefinitely. The balance between market power and state power recalibrated. There was no dramatic collapse, no final battle. The network faded as incentives shifted and alternatives emerged. What remained was the lesson. You don't need sovereignty to wield power. You don't need armies if you control access. And you don't need ideology when incentives do the work. As systems changed, as trade routes shifted, states learned how to tax, protect, and enforce at a scale markets alone could no longer match. The balance slowly adjusted. Market power didn't disappear, but it stopped operating unchecked. What replaced it was not a single winner, but a new equilibrium between authority and access. And that is the lesson worth remembering. Power does not always announce itself with crowns or cannons. It often emerges quietly, where coordination replaces command and incentives outperform force. You don't need formal sovereignty to shape outcomes. You need alignment. You don't need armies if you can decide who participates and who is excluded. And you don't need ideology when systems reward cooperation automatically. The merchants of the Hanseatic world never ruled through law or conquest. They ruled by solving problems no one else could solve at the time. They made trade safer. They made trust scalable. They made reliability profitable. And in doing so, they became unavoidable. That pattern has not vanished. It has simply changed form. If this story altered how you think about power, markets, or history, take a moment to subscribe. These dynamics didn't begin in the modern world. They were forged centuries ago. History doesn't just explain where we came from. It explains how influence really works. And once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere.